So the answers to the U-triads on our last video are listed here, but I wanted to show you that you can also check your answers, sort of. If you go into your calculator and go into the mode and put yourself in degree mode, so make sure the degree is lit up, and then type in sine inverse of negative radical 2 over 2 and hit enter, your calculator will give you the degree value. Now, if you keep it in radians, it's just going to give you a big long decimal. We don't want the decimal. We want it as an exact answer, but it's pretty easy to take negative 45 degrees and then convert it like we did previously. Pen's a little off here. Remember, cancel out, and then negative 45 divided by 180, and then the pi is going to give you the negative pi over 4. So if I go back in, just to kind of reiterate here, I can do, I'm going to do second answer, and then just type over, instead of sine inverse, I'm going to do cosine inverse. So second cosine, and I get 135 degrees. Well, remember from your unit circle, 135 degrees corresponds to 3 pi over 4. And again, if you forget, you can always calculate it by just changing it using our little handy-dandy pi over 180 formula here, and then reducing 135 over 180 with the pi still attached. So remember how to do that. 135 divide 180, and then math enter enter will give you the 3/4, and then you just tack on the pi. So check tangent inverse -1 and make sure it comes up negative 45 degrees, but you need to then convert it to radian measurement. Degree measurement won't cut it. Still in section 3.1, we're going to be looking at double and composite trig functions. So it gets a little crazy here, but we want to check out the properties. If they're the same trig function, in other words, sine inverse and sine inside, both sines, if our our x value is going to be negative pi over 2 to pi over 2 if x happens to be in that interval. If not, then we're going to have to switch it to either quadrant 1 or 4. Sine of sine inverse of x equals x if x happens to be a number between -1 and 1. In other words, if that ratio is between -1 and 1, then we can just give that as an answer. If not, then it's not defined. For cosine inverse of cosine x, if x is a number between 0 and pi, or an angle between 0 and pi, then you can kind of think of it as cross it out, and then your answer is just that angle. If it's not within those boundaries, then you're going to have to switch it to quadrant 1 or 2, depending on the sign of the of your value there. Cosine inverse of x equals x, and again, we can cross out and just use our whatever that number is, as long as that number is between -1 and 1. If it's not, then our function's not defined. Our expression is not defined. Tangent inverse tangent x. And again, the x has to be an angle between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. There should be no equals on here, by the way. If not, then you've got to switch it to quadrant 1 or quadrant 4, depending again of the sign. And then for tangent inverse x equals x, that's true for any x. This will make a little bit more sense as we go through some of these problems here. So sine inverse of sine pi over 4. Because sine inverse is on the outside, our answer should be an angle answer. Okay, so one of the things that I can look at is, can I cross out, and if so, is pi over 4 between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2? And the answer to that is yes, so our answer is pi over 4. Okay. Seems pretty simple. sine inverse of sine 2 pi over 5. Well, again, you got to think, well, where's 2 pi over 5? That's not one of our special angles. So if you're a little unsure, does that fall in quadrant 1 or quadrant 4? It wouldn't be in quadrant 4 because that'd have to be a negative angle, but does it fall in quadrant 1? Well, off to the side, take 2 pi over 5 and convert that to degrees. As long as it's less than 90 degrees, we're good to go. So let's go ahead and multiply that out. 2 times 180 divided by 5, 72 degrees, which means 72 degrees would be about here, which puts us in quadrant 1. So I can do the cross out and say 2 pi over 5, not 72 degrees. All right, but let's take a look at sine inverse of sine 3 pi over 4. Again, because the inverse function's on the outside, I should expect an angle answer out. Let's just do angle answer here. All right, so 3 pi over 4. Now, 3 pi over 4 is sitting over here. I need to be an answer in either quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. The sine function is positive over here. All right, that's radical 2 over 2. All right, so I need a value where sine is positive either in quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. And over here in quadrant 1, and again, you might have to look at your unit circle to make sure of this, but over here in quadrant 1, the angle is pi over 4, where I also get square root 2 over 2. Over here, I'm out of bounds. So I can't cross these out and then just say, well, my answer is 3 pi over 4. You're out of bounds. Your angle has to be between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. And pi over 4 fits the bill. All right, that is a value between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. 3 pi over 4 is out of bounds. Here's negative pi over 2, here's pi over 2. Find the exact value of sine inverse sine 5 pi over 4. Now, 5 pi over 4, thinking about where that would be on the unit circle. 5 pi over 4 is, let's see, we got pi over 4, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, 5 pi over 4. Out of bounds, all right? You can only be over here or here. Sine is negative in quadrant 3. In other words, our y value is negative radical 2 over 2 down here. So between quadrant 1 and quadrant 4, the question is, where do I have a negative radical 2 over 2 for my y value? And that would be in quadrant 4. But I can't just look at my unit circle and go, oh, well, that's 5 pi, 6 pi, 7 pi over 4, because you're coming around the wrong direction. Remember, your answer has to be one between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. So if I'm coming in this direction to get it, that would be negative pi over 4. Let's try this last one here. Sine inverse, so again, looking for an angle. The angle has to be between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. All right, and I've got to think 9 pi over 8. That does not sound like one in quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. 9 pi over 8. 8 pi over 8 would be sitting here. 8 pi over 8 is pi. So 9 pi over 8 is just beyond that, right there. Totally out of bounds. Quadrant 3 isn't going to work for us. The sign, SIGN, value down here is negative something. I don't know what sine of 9 pi over 8 is. That's not one of my special angles. But I know it's negative. And between quadrant 1 and quadrant 4, I'm going to have to be down here in quadrant 4 because that's where sine is also negative. The question is, well, what the heck is this coming around? Well, let's think about it. We're pi over 8, 1 pi over 8 beyond the 8 pi over 8 to get to 9 pi over 8. Symmetry would put this at pi over 8 over here, which means coming in the negative direction, this would be negative pi over 8. It's all about symmetry. All right. Let's take a look at these next values here. In example 15 now, we're looking for not an angle, but a ratio, because sine is on the outside. So whatever I come up with is going to be a ratio. And remember, that ratio has to be between -1 and +1. So as long as this number is between -1 and +1, I can cancel out and just give that as an answer. But in example 16, again, looking for a ratio, and that ratio has to be between -1 and +1, now we're out of bounds. There is no -1.9 on the unit circle. Our unit circle only goes as big as +1 and as small as -1. So in this case, it's undefined. There is no way of fixing that. You can fix an angle and move an angle around, but you can't fix a ratio. So for example 17 and 18, you're again, the inverse is on the outside, so what you're looking for is an angle. Your hope is that you can cancel these out and just write down 5 pi over 6. But remember that 5 pi over 6 has to be, for cosine, a value between 0 and pi, and it is. 5 pi over 6 is in quadrant 2, so our answer is 5 pi over 6. They do cancel out. But on question 18, 5 pi over 4, and this is where you really got to be comfortable with fractions. 4 pi over 4 would be here, which reduces to pi. 5 pi over 4 would be a pi over 4 beyond that. Right? This is 4 pi over 4, so you're a pi over 4 outside of that. And for cosine, remember, you have to be between 0 and pi. So you're out of bounds in quadrant 3. Cosine is negative down here. Right? So I'm not going to be able to just cross it out and say, well, my answer is 5 pi over 4. I need, in quadrant 1 or quadrant 2, where is the cosine value negative? And it's negative here. All right. We're pi over 4 beyond the 4 pi over 4. So with symmetry, we're going to be pi over 4 back away from 4 pi over 4, which would put me at 3 pi over 4. Problems 19 and 20, we're looking again at an answer of a ratio, and for cosine, the ratio has to be a value between -1 and 1, and if it is, boom, we cancel, we write it down. But if it's outside the limits of -1 to +1, then we have to say it's undefined. Okay, it's not between -1 and +1. So for example 21, Again, part of this is just knowing, are you looking for a ratio or are you looking for an angle? What the heck are you looking for? So again, since it's the inverse on the outside, we're looking for an angle. And then the other part is knowing what are your limitations. You have to be between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2 for the tangent inverse function. That's your range. You can't go outside of that. So your answer has to be in either quadrant 1 or quadrant 4, coming around in the negative direction. So negative 7 pi over 8, well, that I am coming around in the negative direction, but I'm over here at negative 7 pi over 8. How do I know that? Because negative 8 pi over 8 would be there, negative pi. So I've got to be in either quadrant 1 or 2, and down here, tangent is positive. So if I have a choice between quadrant 1 or quadrant 4, I'm picking quadrant 1 because that's where tangent is also positive. So for this one, and again, kind of think about how far away are you from an x-axis. You're pi over 8 away. So you're going to be pi over 8 away going in the positive direction. So your final answer here is pi over 8. Notice on these past few problems, your angle should be in the family. In other words, if you start out with 8s, you should end up with 8s. If you're in, like a 5 pi over 4 situation, then your denominator is going to be something pi over 4. You're going to stay within the family when you're talking about the same trig functions here. So, before I even get started with this, I know it's going to be something pi over 5. I just need to figure out what pi over 5 is that. 4 pi over 5 would be over here somewhere. Because again, I know 5 pi over 5 is there. So again, I'm either in quadrant 1 or I can be down here in quadrant 4, coming around in the negative direction, but I can't be over here in quadrant 2. Tangent is negative over here, so I've got to be down here because in quadrant 4, tangent's negative. So now it's a matter of figuring out, okay, how far off of an x-axis am I? Well, this piece here would be a pi over 5 angle. So that means over here, this would also be negative, because you're coming around in this direction, 1 pi over 5, or negative pi over 5. Okay. Let's try negative 2 pi over 9. All right, well, let's see. I'm either up here or I'm down here. Because it's negative, I know I'm coming around in this direction. So negative 2 pi over 9, I just need to figure out, am I still in quadrant 4? If so, I can go ahead and cancel and call it negative 2 pi over 9. If not, then I've got to, put it in that quadrant. So if you're not sure, you can always change it to degrees. And then consider, does that work? So the pi's cancel. That'll go in 20 times. So this is really negative 40 degrees. Negative 40 degrees would be about here, which will put me in quadrant 4, and it's a negative value. So yay, I get to cancel those out and call it negative 2 pi over 9. For question number 24 and 25, notice the inverse function isn't on the outside now, so we are looking for a ratio, just a plain number, and that ratio for tangent just has to be a value between negative infinity and positive infinity. And if it is, we can cancel and call it whatever that number is. And the same thing here, we're looking for a ratio. I know some people are going to go, well, pi is an angle. No, pi is 3.14. That's not degrees. That's not radian measurement. Right now we're talking about it in terms of a ratio. And if that ratio is between negative infinity and positive infinity, That's my answer.